Hello there. I see you've stumbled your way into another episode of one of our History Hours. Well, good thing for you, I've got a wonderful tale of hardship, determination, and pure grit that turned the tides in the American Revolution and our fight for a constitutional republic. Welcome to NAGR's Foundations of Freedom. Now, just to get things started off, I want to focus on this painting right here, The Crossing by Emanuel Lutz. Now, I know myself and many of us spent time in schools just kind of looking at this one picture depicting the crossing, and I think myself as well as many others just kind of sum up the entire story of Washington's crossing in this one picture. And we don't really dive any deeper than that. It was one of hundreds of occurrences in the Revolutionary War, so it's easily glossed over when you're just going through your history books. But even though a picture can paint 1,000 words, 1,000 words simply don't describe the harrowing and trying quest that Washington and his men embarked on during that ice-cold Christmas night. The freezing elements of sleet and snow, the monumental logistics of the crossing, and the undying mantra of victory or death were the brushstrokes that painted this truly remarkable story of Washington's crossing and the Christmas miracle of 1776. So, at this point, it's mid-December on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, and Washington finds himself between a bitterly cold winter, enlistment renewals less than a month away, and a well-equipped foe just a few days' march west that had chased he and his men out of New York all the way to the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. He had set camp on the west side of the Delaware River, where the Continental Army endured an ever-present sting of cold and ice. Right now, the fire in his makeshift headquarters is keeping the general warm, and he studies the situation, planning his next move. Washington has had his back against the wall for quite some time now. A demoralized army, re-enlistments up on January 1st, logistics and supply chain problems, and even talks of his removal from his command all have the soon-to-be legendary general in a constant state of angst, only relieved by fervent prayer and a dedication to his battle unmatched by any other. Washington goes back to his map and compass, lamenting, brooding over the losses he and his men had endured. Washington is poring over the local geography, and his gaze lingers on the Hessian-controlled town of Trenton, New Jersey. Hessians being German mercenaries that made up nearly a third of the British Army. There in that town sat Hessian Colonel Johann Rall and his forces that had beaten Washington and the Continentals 5 times already through the Northern Campaign. Retreat after retreat, defeat after debilitating defeat, the Patriots had found themselves always outnumbered, always outgunned, but few of them ever really lacking in spirit. However, even the most passionate man cannot endure the sting of defeat as often as the Continental Army had without some break in his morale. The American cause needs a decisive and a clean-cut victory to satisfy the hunger of the men, to rouse their spirits and show some kind of semblance of a reason to press on for the cause of liberty. Many have homes to return to. They've got families to feed, farms to attend, and businesses to run. Any of them could quit and return home right now and still be smiled upon by posterity. These men were afforded no such luxury as their British opponents, who worked as the professional soldiers to the crown, who made a living doing exactly this. Washington is also aware of this, and he searches for an answer, trying to concoct a last-ditch effort to save the rebellion. The night outside his window is bleak, much like his hopes. Nothing else lighting the scene but a few campfires and the moonlight cutting through the sheets of snow as it falls across the encampment. So, Washington stays up late that night. He's just poring over the logistics, poring over the planning needed to present this to his war council the next day. He's concocted this plan, a monumental task of moving 2,400 men, their ammunition, their food, and 18 pieces of artillery across the ice-choked Delaware River. And while this would most likely seem impossible to you and I, but for a man with God on his side, an entity he often referred to as divine providence in his writings, there was some small chance that this actually could work, but only with impeccable timing and with the element of surprise. Of course, the detailings of the plans are met with skepticism from his war council, but Washington is insistent that this is their only course of action, a last-ditch effort to strike victory into the hearts of his men and fear into the enemy. So Washington draws up these plans and organizes 3 separate crossings in New Jersey, not one like we often thought in school, but 3, where a long and arduous march would be made just in time to attack the Hessians at daybreak. Washington's disinformation campaign would prove to put the oppressors at ease just as the attack broke out, allowing him the element of surprise that was absolutely crucial to this endeavor. This was probably Washington's last Hail Mary to win the war, or at least scrounge together enough to continue it. Along with these plans, Washington also sends out words to General Horatio Gates requesting he join the attack, but Gates writes back that he is simply too ill to make the journey and requests to travel to Philadelphia instead to regain his strength. Washington, of course, grants his request, but tells him to stop at Bristol to calm a dispute going on in a regiment stationed there. In reality, though, Gates has absolutely no confidence in Washington's crazy scheme to take the Hessians head-on to Trenton. While Gates was too sick to travel to Bristol, he ignores Washington's orders and heads all the way to Baltimore, pleading with Congress to remove Washington's command. With the deck stacked against him from both his enemies and his supposed friends, there's absolutely no turning back from this endeavor for Washington. He has to make this work. All options are exhausted, and action is the only course that might right the ship. This is a significant gamble. The night before the crossing, Washington was once again poring over the complex logistics of what they were about to do just before leaving his headquarters. Prominent doctor and signer of the Declaration of Independence, one of the guys that was going to hang if George Washington didn't pull this thing off. His name is Benjamin Rush, and he comes to visit Washington's headquarters that night, and Rush recalls in his meeting, he said, "While I was talking to him, I observed him to play with his pen and ink upon several small pieces of paper. One of them accidentally fell upon the floor near my feet. I was struck with the inscription upon it, 'Victory or Death.'" Now, this same night, Hessian Colonel Rahl Emilius von Donop, goodness gracious, freaking long name. This guy is enjoying a town he personally finds quite warm and quite accommodating, and for good reason. Mount Holly, New Jersey, is about 18 miles north of the town of Trenton. Now, von Donop has been traveling south, and he's charged with reinforcing Colonel Rahl's forces in Trenton, but also he's given the liberty to kind of make his own calls on where he stations himself in order to achieve this goal. But he finds himself pretty distracted along the way. A captain of his company had wrote, "The colonel, who was extremely devoted to the fair sex, had found in his quarters the exceedingly beautiful young widow of a doctor. He wanted to set up his rest quarters in Mount Holly, which, to the misfortune of Colonel Rahl, he was permitted to do." The idea of the cold, wet, and honestly messy slog seemed to make the separation of Von Donop and his newly acquainted mistress seem impossible. So he resolves to stay in her loving arms instead of continuing the trek to Trenton. Now, local rumors often tell the tale that not all patriots bore muskets that night. As a matter of fact, this one didn't bear anything at all, as the mistress in question was none other than Betsy Ross. No matter who the rumored woman was that stayed Colonel Von Donop's advance, the Hessian military was not aware of the opposition amassing around McConkey's Ferry on the east side of the Delaware River just as the sun set on that Christmas night. But sadly, the operations for the Continental Army are falling apart before they even begin. Washington orders those three forces to cross the Delaware, but it's already off to a bad start. It's actually a disaster, to be honest. Crossings are supposed to start at 4:40 p.m. This is just as darkness falls over the operation, but 8 miles to the south, General James Ewing and his 800 men don't even leave camp until a little after 4 p.m. and start marching towards the river. The weather has been mild with a light drizzle as the men began to leave, but just at sunset, the men were stung with a bitter rain for the duration of the march. Upon arriving to the river, Ewing discovers a near impassable obstacle of the ice-choked Delaware. At this crossing, the river is tidal, so in other words, it's affected by the tide, and ice is pretty much backed up for miles. Ice that is difficult to navigate boats through, but impossible to cross on foot. So by 11 o'clock, the driving rain turns into a blistering nor'easter. It's awful. It's pelting the boats and crew. It's making passage that was exceedingly difficult during the day, a true winter hell attempting it in the dark. John Greenwood recalled that it blew a perfect hurricane. But as the night went on, the solemn reality set in. Without a change in weather or a shift in tides, Washington will face the Hessians at Trenton without the 800 men of Ewing's company. Likewise, even further down the river, General Cadwalader's force of 1,800 finds their crossing to be chaotically turbulent, with dangerous ice floes threatening to smash the Durham boats and sink his men to their certain death. Several advance parties of men actually make it to the other side, having to walk the remaining 150 yards to the shore on top of the frozen river. Attempts are continually made to smash the ice as it will not support the cannon, but before long the nor'easter begins to pile up ice faster than the men can break it. The worsening weather forces Cadwalader to pull them back, of which many men wanted to press on the attack alone. So Yeah, by this time it's midnight, and Washington's plan has completely unraveled. It's a disaster, and he's looking across from the western shore of the river as his men toil through the back-breaking labor of his crossing. He anxiously glances at his pocket watch. 2 hours behind already. An attack during the daylight will ruin his element of surprise and cost him the precious lives of his men, but his mantra echoes through his thoughts: victory or death. Washington's frustrations not only lie with the tardiness of the plan, but also the messenger boy that rides up to right beside him before he makes the crossing. "What a time to be handing me letters," Washington barks as he saddles his horse. The messenger apologizes and explains that he is there on orders from Horatio Gates. "Gates! Where is he?" demands Washington. "I understood he was on his way to Congress." Washington brims at the news of this open insubordination from Gates, but he quickly swallows his emotion, realizing his focus must rely on the task at hand. Not only his tardiness, extreme weather, and bad timing cost him precious hours, but now he's receiving news of insubordination abroad. The walls are starting to close in for the future leader of the nation. Henry Knox, the man Washington entrusted with getting all 18 pieces of the artillery over the Delaware, bellows out orders, his deep baritone voice cutting through the thin, cold air of the night. Many suppose that the operation would have been lost had it not been for Knox's ability to belt out these orders and commands. The crossing presses on with an assortment of 25 vessels, most of them labeled as Durham boats, with wide flat bottoms that can not only accommodate the men, but horses and cannon as well. Any soldier making the crossing endures about 6 to 8 inches of freezing water in the bottom of these boats, and they're routinely reminded to jump up and down to break up the ice should it freeze their legs in place, and in order to bob the boat up and down to keep the ice from attaching to the hull. Henry Knox later wrote to his wife about the ordeal that it was done with almost infinite difficulty, but perseverance accomplished what at first seemed impossible. Particularly disturbing was the fact that a vast majority of men in the 18th century in fact did not even know how to swim, making the operation even more deadly. As soldiers began to pile up on the western shore, John Greenwood later remarked, "We had to wait for the rest, and so began to pull down the fences and make fires to warm ourselves, for the storm was increasing rapidly. I perfectly recollect after putting the rails on to burn, the wind and the fire would cut them in two in a moment, and when I turned my face toward the fire, my back would be freezing. By turning around and around, I kept myself from perishing before the large bonfire. The noise of the soldiers coming over and clearing away the ice, the rattling of the cannon wheels on the frozen ground, and the cheerfulness of my fellow comrades encouraged me beyond expression, and, big coward as I acknowledge myself to be, I felt great pleasure, more than I do now, in writing about it." The crossing in itself is a miracle. Death does not find its grasp on any of the men, and every single piece of artillery had been delivered without incident. However, the Continental Army is now 3 to 4 hours behind its original plan. The hopes of attack concealed in darkness have now completely vanished. The trouble of crossing Delaware at such a difficult time is now pretty much done in vain. Washington cannot make up the time needed to, but he simply has no choice. Washington remarks on the ordeal later, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events." At the outset from the Delaware River, Washington pulls out several copies of a pamphlet written by the famous writer Thomas Paine. He disperses them to his officers to read to their troops, but when Henry Knox's powerful voice begins reciting the words, all the men stop and listen. For in these words could be found the strength, encouragement, and motivation to keep pressing on, to truly take to heart the mantra of victory or death. And if you want to know what the contents of that lyrical miracle reciting on the east shore of the Delaware River was that night, you're going to have to watch to the end of this video. Trust me, it's worth it. And so begins the long march to Trenton. Their first obstacle, a 200-foot incline away from the river, set the tone for the remainder of the journey. Over rocks and roots, ice and mud, it was reported that the troop traveled at the pace of a child, stopping very frequently. As word broke out that Washington's Continental Army was advancing through the woods, however, local guides show up to help the men traverse the unfamiliar wilderness. The army travels for roughly a mile and a half with similar challenges when they came to the intersection of Bear Tavern Road, their direct shot to Trenton. For the next mile, the men began to pick up pace, making up precious time on these straight and level roads. Well, that is until Jacob's Creek. A swift, flowing ravine that had cut a winding gully through the landscape about 100 feet below. For the men, this was a challenge, but with artillery and horses, it became back-breaking. As was the custom with European armies, the British relied on about 2 or 3 pieces of artillery per 1,000 men, but in this true American fashion, that just wouldn't do. Henry Knox had doubled and nearly tripled that ratio to 7 to 8 per 1,000. But with even a 6-pounder weighing in at 1,750 pounds and about 1 full ton when loaded with ammunition powder, this advantage on the battlefield became quite the hindrance on the battle path. Soldiers break out the drag lines for the cannon, lace them up, and harness the ropes around trees for mechanical leverage. Each cannon has to be slowly lowered down this 100-foot entrenchment on one side of the ravine. Then once they get to the bottom, they have to lash it up and pull it 100 feet back up the other side, marking a particularly dangerous battle with gravity for the men pushing the cannon from the bottom of the ravine. So this is basically, can you imagine if you and your friends got together and say, hey, we're going to take this Geo Metro and we're going to take it to the bottom of this ravine, 100 foot down, 100 foot back up using only ropes. That's basically what these guys are doing, but they're doing it 18 times. They're facing an awful challenge with this, but during the entire debacle, Washington is riding back and forth. He's encouraging his men, and unfortunately the ground is very slippery and hard in some places and slick and muddy in others. The general is riding back and forth when a glimpse of Washington's competence and strength is briefly picked up on by Lieutenant Bostwick, an act that, had it not been documented, would have been forgotten by history forever. Bostwick recalls the spectacle. While passing a slanting, slippery bank, His Excellency's horse hind feet both slip from under him. As Washington's steed quickly begins to just slump to the ground, the general's powerful hands latch into the animal's mane, shifting the beast's waist by brute force alone. Bostwick said he seized his horse's mane and the horse recovered. Several others had witnessed the feat of coordination and strength, convincing them of the ability of their leader and rousing their spirits. The remainders that maybe weren't convinced before are starting to think, hey, this might be the guy that we need to follow into battle. Upon the passage of Jacob's Creek, the men are faced with a renewed strength of the storm. Greenwood wrote, during the whole night it alternatively hailed, rained, snowed, and blew tremendously. A violent storm of rain, hail, and snow intermixed. At the end of this stretch of road, the sheer exposure, the exhaustion, and labor are really beginning to set in on these guys, and they're barely halfway there. Men have to be roused repeatedly from sleeping on the side of the road, as any moment of sleep would easily mean death. And sadly, it did for 2 unfortunate souls who never finished their march to Trenton. Washington and his men take a brief break at Birmingham, where Washington is notified that the sleet, rain, and snow has all but soaked their black powder, rendering many muskets useless for the battle ahead. Now, of course, for a flash of a moment, doubt is starting to creep into his mind at this point, as it would me. But fortunately, the commander has already steeled himself for any and all setbacks. They've come this far, they can't stop now. Victory or death. Washington tells his men to instead use their bayonets if their rifles will not fire. Advance and charge. At this point, about halfway to Trenton, Washington decides to divide his forces to cover 2 angles of attack on the town. Nathaniel Greene is to take he and his men by way of the more treacherous Upper Ferry Road. Washington is going to join them. General Sullivan is to take the shorter route, the River Road, taking special precaution not to outrun Washington and Greene coming in from the north. At this point, Washington orders his leaders to all synchronize their watches, one of the first instances of this tactic actually being practiced in wartime history. I thought that was pretty cool. Both columns depart Birmingham and make their way towards the unaware Hessians. It's about 7:30 a.m. when Washington looks down at his watch. By his estimations, daybreak should have been 10 minutes ago. However, the gales of the nor'easter have blocked out all sunlight. It might as well be dark at this point. Washington is roused from his contemplating when alerts are sent up from his forward columns. A sizable force of men are marching directly towards them. Who they are and why they're here is yet to be seen. Ice runs through the commander's vein as he spurs his horse to the front, putting his men on alert for an attack. Before the orders are shouted, a thick Virginia accent pierces through the cold. "Don't shoot! We're with you!" Continental officers squint into the night until they see Virginian George Wallace seemingly in good spirits. George Wallace served as a captain to Adam Stevens' 4th Regiment, but why he and his 50 men had just showed up marching from Trenton is a mystery Washington is wildly curious about, and rightfully so. Demanding an explanation, Wallace proudly reported that the Virginia Militia Regiment was just on its way back from killing 4 Hessians and wounding 11. Just days before, the Hessians had launched a surprise attack across the river on Stevens' men, killing one of their boys. In an act of revenge, Stephen had took it upon himself to give those Hessians a dose of their own medicine, even though he was still aware of Washington's grand attack plans that night. Plans that needed secrecy, needed the element of surprise. Washington's blood boils as the news is relayed to him. He demands to see Stevens front and center to confirm the detail. As Adam Stevens admits to the attack, Washington feels as though the wind has been taken from his lungs. All this work, all this planning, the death of the 2 soldiers on the trip, the exhaustion, all to gain the element of surprise, and now this. All hopes for a surprise attack had been completely shattered. Washington wonders, has this been done on purpose, as this was not his first encounter with Mr. Stevens here. For years, the men had been political rivals to one another, with Washington nearly always attaining the upper hand. Was this just another act of insolent sabotage? Not only was insubordination racking the general's thoughts abroad, but now starkly stared him in the face in what was to be his only reprisal for saving the revolution. You, sir, may have ruined my plans for having put them on guard. The officers around Washington had never seen their commander in such a fury as his voice boomed through the wind, admonishing Stevens for initiating his own private plans of revenge and retribution against the Hessians. All had seemed lost at this point, but they had come this far. Nothing was going to change the mantra of victory or death. Washington would salvage what he could out of this attack or die trying. For the past week, Lieutenant Andreas von Weiderholt had his men under intense guard duty, and by this time they were very tired. Every major road in or out of Trenton was being very carefully watched, with detachments of Hessian guards not far behind the forward guard stations ready to lend a hand should the rebels launch a surprise attack. Unbeknownst to Washington, there were also spies among his men in the British service who had reported just such an attack was to take place tonight. When Adam Stevens' men attacked and were easily driven back, a certain relaxation among the outposts spread. The Hessians, thinking the pathetic attack was all that was to be expected, thought their preparations and paranoia to be, overkill by now, and they could relax a little bit. The strain of such a thorough and long watch, and the sting of the brutal gales, the pelting sleet, the horrible visibility at this point, and the fact that an attack that was already expected had been driven back, the entire forward base was pretty much put at ease at this point. It seems that divine providence has quite a way at taking things we see as setbacks and turning them into the very things that might very well secure our victory. In the forward outpost, Lieutenant Weiderholt laughs as he and his fellow Hessian officers trade stories of Christmases back home. The lone cabin they were in had grown pretty stuffy with 17 guards packed inside the relatively small space. He stands up and he walks outside to get just a little bit of air. Opening the door, the bitter cold blusters against his face as the wind sweeps across the fields before him, carrying sheets of snow across the landscape. It's almost beautiful, but in the distance, a dark mass starts forming. It must be the detachment from Captain Brubach, an inspector of the guard who was coming by to ensure the forward detachment was well equipped. Weiderholt turned around to notify his men of the inspection when he looked back for no particular reason. He noticed this wasn't just a detachment, though. There were 40, 50, 60, that's 100 men out there in the snow. Out of sheer hope, he begins to contemplate what friendly force it could be. But there's far too many of them right now. Whack! Pine splinters off the door frame beside him as a hot musket ball burrows into the wood, spraying his face. "Der Fiend! The enemy!" Suddenly, a volley opens up on the shack as the lieutenant dives behind the door frame. Washington leads the attack from the center, watching as 3 separate columns of Patriot forces engulf the guardhouse with musket fire. By the time the third volley impacts the house, the Germans have suited up and rallied, ready for battle, retaliating with their own fire. Washington is astonished that after all this misfortune, all 3 branches of his army right now are attacking at precisely the correct moment, leaving the Hessians scrambling everywhere. As Weiderholt raises his musket to return fire, he sees this isn't just a roaming detachment. How this massive force of men made their way to him without sounding an alarm is totally beyond his knowledge, but they can worry about that later. The battle is at hand right in front of him. Now, the deafening sound of American artillery is traveling across the battlefields, erupting large banks of roots and dirt from the earth all around the Hessian guardhouse. The timing of the Continentals allows them to perfectly execute a double envelope of their enemy, and realizing just how many men he's up against, and just before being completely surrounded, Weiderholt retreats back to town, all the way being harassed from different branches of Washington's army in tactical positions leading all the way back to Trenton. The Germans, as Washington will later recall, put up a valiant fighting retreat, firing, reloading, and running as the Continentals bear down on them. At the same time, General Sullivan commences his attack from the river road, driving the Hessians from their forward outpost, joining the retreating allies back towards town. As the Hessian Jaegers continue their fighting retreat, blasts from the Pennsylvania side of the river open up, pelting the town with cannon fire. Trenton was now under attack from the north by Washington, from the west by Sullivan, and the south from artillery. At the sound of musket fire and artillery, 3 Hessian regiments pour out of the center of town as angry wasps ready to defend the hive. Regardless, Sullivan's men sweep through the town from the west, picking off Hessian soldiers and pressing the advance in a controlled chaos that forces their enemy into no other options but to flee. Greene's division, along with Washington from the north, presses deep into enemy lines. After suffering all night through the cold, rain, sleet, and snow, a renewed energy comes over the men as a uniting presence fills their ranks and drives them on. The Continentals are fighting for their homeland, unlike the conscripted soldiers of the German army. This fighting spirit took them all the way to the intersection at King and Queen Street, a tactical high ground overlooking the entire town. One deciding factor further sealed the Hessians' feat as Lieutenant Viterholt reported to Colonel Rahl that the Americans were pushing in from both the left and the right. In the chaos, Viterholt mistakenly believed that the Americans had the town surrounded from both the left and the right. Had the Hessians retreated to the east and set up defenses, it could have spelt doom for the much outnumbered American army, but no such defense was ever mustered because of this bad advice. Believing this, and also adhering to traditional German tactics, Colonel Rahl decides to meet Washington's force head on. A decision that very well could be the reason you and I are free from British tyranny today. Washington sits high atop King Street, watching as his men sweep in from the west. Further south, he can see Sullivan's forces driving through the town, tactfully positioning themselves as they press from building to building. Unfortunately, a flash of color catches his eye as the Hessians begin to form ranks and march up King Street. Washington, having a keen eye on the battlefield, later laments that while the Germans were forming ranks, they did seem all too hesitant and confused as to how to respond. Even in a confused state, though, these Hessian forces are not to be taken lightly. The counterattack was swift as Rahl ordered cannons advance on the high ground of the Americans. The Hessians opened up an artillery barrage, striking and killing a horse that was pulling an American 3-pounder. But once again, thanks to Henry Knox's implementation of overwhelming force by artillery, the Americans were able to answer as roughly about 10 cannons joined in with 2 howitzers opening up on the defending Hessians. A mass of lead, steel, and grape shot hurled down King Street, striking 5 horses and 8 Germans. Rocks, cobblestones are exploding all over the Hessians as musket fire sinks into the surrounding walls. What doesn't strike the Hessians right on, splinters rock into their faces, already stinging from the brutal winter storm. They have no other option but to run here. Without artillery to cover them, Rahl rides up on his horse, directing his grenadiers to the center of town to the English church, attempting to regain some kind of order for his men. From there, Rahl knew Washington had attained the high ground and he needed to flank the Continentals if he wished to strike back. Washington watches from the high ground above as Rahl's forces begin rushing through an apple orchard towards the east, away from the buildings and homes of Trenton. Washington swiftly responds, sending 2 regiments along the Princeton Road to cut Rahl off from the even higher ground to Washington's left. Rahl also finds out that 2 German field guns have been abandoned on King Street. He sends another force to take those guns back. The embarrassment of the forfeiture artillery stung the Hessian pride and roused a determination in the German ranks. The Hessians move into King Street with a strong intent to regain those guns, and regain them they do. However, by this time, Sullivan's men have made their way almost to King Street when the Hessians arrive. As the Hessians fight back and they retake these cannons, St. Clair's men from Sullivan's forces open up on the Germans, catching them in a deadly crossfire between Washington and Greene's high ground and Sullivan's advance from the west. As the enemy lines begin to break again, Sergeant White charges the German artillery wielding a cavalry sword. By the time he got there, only 1 German remained, who was promptly chased off by White as he swings his saber through the air, shouting at him to retreat. Before long, the Americans had driven the Hessians back once again. Upon capturing the cannon, White's men noticed that, hey, this is all ready to fire. So they turn the cannon upon the retreating Hessians and unload a fire of grape shot in their direction, further scattering Rahl's forces. Near Colonel Rahl's headquarters, another battle is raging. Hessian Grenadier Johann Ruber later wrote that the rebels attacked us ferociously. Near Colonel Rahl's quarters was that barricade of boards, and in front of that stood our 2-company cannon. As the Americans were attempting to reach the cannon, we of Rahl's Grenadier Regiment encountered them directly in front of Rahl's headquarters. The fight was furious. The rebels dismantled the barricade, and now we lost the greater part of our artillery, and the rebels were about to use them. Here, Colonel Rahl rallies his men as all hell is breaking loose around him. The Americans are mercilessly aiming towards the officers and taking them down one by one. Colonel Rahl turns his horse to watch another of his command fall from his just before two thuds land soundly into his own side. The hot musket balls do terrible damage, causing heavy bleeding for Rahl. He is escorted and helped off of his horse and carried to a nearby church where no amount of medical attention is going to be able to save him that night. It was at this point that the crescendo of the battle pierced the hearts of both sides. All forms of explosions echo through the hills surrounding the town. Glass shatters, boards break, and men wail as blood runs through the streets, thawing the ice and then quickly refreezing. Henry Knox was struck by the mayhem unfolding before him. Here succeeded a scene of war which I had often conceived but never saw before. The hurry, the fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump shall sound. In all, 70 Hessians lie wounded in the center of the town, along with their colonel, who many had the honor of dying for. The rest disperse in a panicked retreat, hiding among houses and alleys as they make their way east, retreating to the apple orchard, some fleeing across the creek. The lines, as well as the spirit of the Hessian forces, are broken. Washington's men close in around them at the orchard, where the American forces called for a German surrender. The fighting had reached an eerie pause when Washington's aide rides forward to discuss terms of surrender with Lieutenant Colonel Francis Scheffer and Major Jost Matthaus. The aide return, and Washington impatiently awaits their answer. Precious time passes, and after several minutes, Washington is beginning to expect a last-ditch counterattack from the Hessians. He turns to his artillery detachment, instructing them to change from round shot to canister shells for the nearing battle. Just as his men begin to switch out the ammunition, a militiaman exclaimed, "Look, their colors are down!" So they are. All in all, 896 Hessians were captured by the Americans along with their possessions. 83 lie wounded and 22 killed. While only 4 Americans were wounded in the attack, many had died from the exhaustion and sheer exposure of the Trenton to Trenton. The number of Americans that died from non-combat related causes will never be known, but could have been 2 or 3 dozen men. The news of Washington's victory at Trenton spreads far and wide. Never before in the fight for freedom in the colonies had one victory stoked so much patriotism. Many writings from Loyalists and British alike outlined their dismay for the lifting of spirits on the Patriot side and just how difficult it was going to be to bring the war to an end in the face of such zeal from the colonists. News rings out from New York to London, and all manner of blaming and accusations are thrown about for the defeat at Trenton. A painful angst erupts among the members of those loyal to the crown, understanding that the appetite for liberty has just been renewed. However, while things seem jovial for the colonists as a whole, Washington is facing an important question. Well, what do we do next? They stayed up talking about this all night, and eventually enough hearts are turned, and by December 28th, as soon as December 28th, Washington's forces were moving once again. Even though 35% of his men were considered not fit for battle before the first crossing, and probably even more by now, they pushed on in what seemed to be an insane, insatiable desire to capitalize on the last victory. They all agreed that the victory at Trenton could be considered a fluke, and they wanted to capitalize on it. But December 31st was finally upon them. In Trenton, Washington stands in front of his men, awaiting his time to make one last concession for them not to abandon the cause. These men right here, they've been beaten, bruised, frozen, shot at, and starved for a year. Logistics problems pained their cause as news swirled through the ranks that near every man would be going home, unwilling to assist in the fight. Washington's passion gives way to the secret desire to shackle them together, holding them in their barracks and forcing them to fight. But, on the other hand, he also knows that they have done more than he had ever asked of them. So today, he begged for them to stay on for just 6 more weeks. Local militias had found success by offering a significant $10 pay to anyone who would agree to stay. As the drums began to beat for volunteers, Washington inwardly prayed the tactic would work. After some time, his heart sank. He had done what was impossible. He had brought the revolution back from the brink. He had led these men into Trenton and done what no one thought he could. All to be rewarded with this? Not one man moved from their lines. All were resolved to return home. Washington, of course, wouldn't have it. He bounds over to his horse, saddling it, and begins riding across the columns of men, shouting as loud as he can to reach every ear. "My brave fellows, you have done all I have asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected, but your country is at stake. Your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with the fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country which you probably can never do under any other circumstances." A quiet pause fell across the moment as the breath of the men evaporated in the cold air. The drums began to beat again, and suddenly one man began to talk to one another, and then another. Soon there was a quiet murmur amongst them. "Well, if you stay, I'll stay with you. Only if you stay will I. I'll go if you'll go." A few moments in, one man marched forward, followed by another, and another, and another after that. And pretty soon, quote, "their example was followed by nearly all who were fit for duty in their regiment, amounting to about 200 volunteers." A tear wells up in Washington's throat when the men he wanted to shackle just hours ago gained all the respect he could ever muster for a fellow soul. And from now on, Washington and his officers would break from the English tradition of looking down on enlisted recruits, but would treat them as fellow men. A change that shocked and confused the British military, of course. They had never seen such a thing. But Washington had done it. He had saved the revolution just for now. Yet even he wasn't aware of the daunting task that lay before him. Nearly half of those men who stepped forward would be killed in battle or die of exposure soon after their decision to stay. And yet, this is the price for freedom. A price that we have never been asked to pay for. And with the way things are looking in America right now, it's quite obvious that we really haven't paid our dues for the liberties we now richly and unknowingly enjoy. For freedom always has a price, and we can choose to pay that price over the course of our lives by remaining vigilant in the fight for our own freedom, or we can delay that payment, making it much more expensive for possibly ourselves and more likely for future generations. That price for freedom will not change, but we get to decide how big or small the payments are. And the sooner we decide, the better. That's why I'm asking you to join us in protecting the values that these brave men fought for, suffered for, and died for. Along the way, we'll experience such delays as Washington did at the outset of his crossing. Just as Washington, we may experience storms that seem to pitch us around, making our journey near impossible, when in reality it's the storm that keeps us safe and protected from the enemy. Just as Washington, there are going to be doubters who challenge our tactics, who move in to subvert our plans while claiming to be on our side. Just as Washington, maybe some of those plans of subversion will aid us in our mission. Just as Major Stevens unknowingly put the Hessians at ease that Christmas night in the act of defying Washington's orders. For it was these miraculous occurrences that led Washington to later address Congress in his first inaugural address. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. In case you don't know, he capitalizes invisible hand. Of course, he's talking about God. While things may look bleak now, we can look forward with this consolation that we can be like Washington, a man of prayer, a man of determination, whose mantra that night was victory or death. Just as Washington begged his men to re-enlist, I too urge you to not give up the fight. That may start with joining the National Association for Gun Rights, but I want to be clear. I am eternally grateful that men far greater than I didn't allow their impact on their nation to stop with just a $30 a year renewal fee. The price for liberty goes far, far beyond that, and I ask that you renew your spirits and your fight to be vigilant and attentive to the world around you, and then act upon it. All the while teaching your children not only to do the same, but explain why it needs to be done. Even signing up for email updates with us using the link below in the description, that's going to keep you aware of what's going on in the fight for your Second Amendment rights and give you action items to take to the front lines. As promised earlier in the video, I'm going to conclude by urging for you to join us with the words of Thomas Paine. Words that brought forth the bravery, tenacity, and dedication of men to meet their enemy head on, victory or death. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.